Hello and welcome to Business Tales, the podcast where we dive deep into the past, the present and the future of the business journey. I'm your host, Chris Simmons, and I'm thrilled to have you here as we explore the stories behind the successes, challenges and lessons. In each episode, we'll uncover the good, the bad and the invaluable experiences that shape our professional lives. So whether you're an entrepreneur, a seasoned executive, or just someone passionate about business, there's something here for everyone. Without any further ado, let's dive into the conversation. Buckle up for a fantastic episode featuring Rowan Jackson, a man who navigated life with grit, tenacity, and a little bit of humour. From his beginnings at Birmingham University, which he kindly left after a brief encounter with some exams, then you earned your Royal Commando Green Beret in the Royal Marines. You've also taken the road less travelled, but it's been a heck of a ride, I think. Really looking forward to hearing about some of this. You didn't let a life-altering accident slow you down, though. You instead pivoted from the military life to the corporate world, eventually landing at Buckingham Palace as Prince Philip's equerry, which I would very much like to hear about. After a stint in the royal arena, you went from Buckingham to the boardrooms. Oh, you can tell I've written this. This is great fun. And now you're the founder of Promising Outcomes. You're the go-to guy for organizations looking to turn chaos into success. So we'll be talking about your insights, your leadership, the way that you've navigated these changes in life. We're also going to be talking about some of the cool and interesting parts of running this business, Promising Outcomes, and kind of how you really got to where you got to. So welcome to the podcast, Rowan. Lovely to speak to you.
Good morning.
So let's start at the very beginning. Birmingham University. You learned how to run a business as early as Birmingham University. What was going on there?
No, it was very simple. My school told my parents that they didn't think I was going to get into medical school. So they said, you need a fallback. And I said, to my father, I enjoyed sailing. So he said, why don't you join the Royal Navy as a seaman officer, which I passed into. And then I passed into medical school, confounding everyone. Having been here for a year, too much non-academic activities, I then was kicked out because I failed my exams. And I was enabled to do a number of very sort of simple jobs, like being a bricklayer and working on building a prison. And finally, I found myself applying for the Royal Marines in 1969. And I went through the young officers training for a year and a half.
Wow. So the way I like to have these conversations is kind of just, let's set us up for some of the past conversation by letting us know what it is you do now. So we'll talk about some of the present stuff that's going on. I can see all the files in the background there. So obviously you're working hard still. So give us a little bit of a rundown of what's Promising Outcomes, what do you do, and why that over something else?
Yes, we exist to help organizations to measure and then improve the relationship with three key stakeholder groups: their customers, their employees, and their suppliers. We do that by understanding, firstly, what are the expectations of those stakeholders, and then secondly, by measuring the organization's performance against those expectations. This produces a prioritized list of areas for improvement, which we then, thirdly, workshop with the executive team of the organization. And that workshop produces an action plan, which they then implement, and then they are able to close the performance gaps that we've identified, and then improve their business, improve the performance for shareholders, performance for employees and suppliers, and performance for the owners in the end. So they make bigger profits because they are profitable, because they've got a better customer experience or an employee experience. And as a result, they become market leaders. And if I just give you one example, relatively small business up in the northwest of England had 96 clients, and we researched the relationship with those clients. And in very simple terms, the result of that has been that they have grown substantially to 146. This is a B2B business, and they're in the top manufacturing businesses in the UK in their sector. They're growing at 22% per annum. Success.
Wow. And I mean that there must have been some decent. The results of that are great, but there must have been some decent work involved to get there, from not just your point of view to identify it, but from their point of view to actually maintain that traction and actually act on it and maintain that traction.
Absolutely. And the important thing that our research identified was that their customers wanted them to improve in two areas: their sales and in their operations. And so they put in place a number of actions to improve in those areas, and those actions have been very successful.
And cheeky question from me, Rowan. Do you do this performance gap analysis work in promising outcomes yourselves? Do you look at inwardly as well as outwardly to other clients?
Yes, we do. And we have actually got the list of expectations of ourselves from our clients.
Wonderful. And did this business come out of the Royal Marine stuff? Did this come out of just general life experience? Because you don't know what to look for until you kind of have lived in something like this. So
I was in the 90s. I was working as a freelancer on a number of roles, and a headhunter called me and said, "Would you be interested in joining this American consulting business?" And I was interviewed by a lovely man called Bill Fonvielle, who, obviously gave me the go-ahead sign. I joined this company. I was there for 5 years. It's an American company with an office in Europe, and I learnt my craft as a consultant there. And in particular, I learned about two very special things. One is, how do you research the relationships with customers and employees, which of course is what I'm doing now. And then secondly, how to facilitate executive leadership teams. And those two areas of expertise have been with me ever since.
And the learning of this, you didn't just learn it in a classroom, so to speak. It's real on the job, on the ground, hands-on type stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've learned in the last few years, particularly working with small businesses, is that you really need to know your stuff in order for them to trust and believe and listen to the actual advice that you give.
Yeah.
And what is it that you typically do in promising outcomes that really builds that trust beyond obviously showing that here's the results, here's our case studies and things like that? Is it the CV that you shared with me? Is that what builds that trust? Because it's mighty cool.
I doubt if it's the CV, but I do know that it is our results, which are the things that tend to impress our clients.
Yeah.
One organisation, for example, who paid us over £400,000 over 3 years, it's not cheap, but they got an $80 million response return on investment. That we can present case studies of where this worked. I think it's worth saying that promising outcomes is in an industry where a vast majority of the players are at the more tactical end of the customer and employee measurement side. We are very, very much at the strategic end. So that we're dealing with businesses which are somewhat larger. They have deep pockets because we're not cheap, and we make no apology for that. And we are working with them on very, very sophisticated levels of insight. If I go back to that manufacturing business, we gave them insight into their operations, which they'd never seen before. And in other cases, we give insight to our clients on how they perform compared to their competition, which most CEOs tend to salivate over. This is stuff they've never seen before.
Yeah.
So there's a very serious competitive difference between us and a lot of the other players in the market.
Well, you may well know this given your military career, but the Sun Tzu quote that says, "Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat."
Correct.
And if you are in an industry where an awful lot of the I say competitors, shall we say, are very tactical in their activities, you can stand out head and shoulders above.
Yes.
And primarily because you can say, well, the tactics are great, but we ought to focus on those once we know the landscape.
Absolutely.
Once we really know everything.
Absolutely.
And so getting all of that data and that insight and that understanding and everything like that, that's really hard, because there's something which I've noted with some of the businesses that I've worked with in the past, that too much data can be paralyzing.
Yep.
Too much insight can be paralyzing.
Yes.
So presumably you've as part of the way that you guys work, you've worked out a way of getting enough, or
Yes.
a way of getting the right information but chunked into something. How's that work? Because in an organization of 50 plus people, say, that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's come back to your point about data. I went to a workshop recently where the chief executive of a company was saying, data is the new oil. And I stood up and said to him, no, data is not the new oil. Insight is the new oil. All of us, and every organization on the planet has tons of data. Much of it is not used. But that's, of course, their problem. No, the issue here is sorting out the wheat from the chaff. And this is about identifying exactly what it is the CEO and the leadership team need to do in order to improve their relationships with their customers, employees, and suppliers. And here's the secret stuff. This is what we actually do. When we're working with an organization, the very first thing we have to have is an understanding of what it is that their customers or their employees or suppliers actually expect. And that gives you context. And if you look at a lot of satisfaction surveys, which we don't do, one of the questions you can ask is satisfied compared to what?
Yeah.
And most people can't answer that question. So, and most satisfaction surveys don't answer that question. So what we're doing is we're providing context. Now that's the most important. The context comes in the form of understanding what a customer, let's stay with customers, for example, a customer expects as an ideal experience. What would I like ideally to have happening? And that is the first point of measurement we do. The second point is, what is the minimum acceptable performance that I would have from this supplier for me to stay with them? And of course, if it's below that minimum acceptable performance, then the customer is likely to switch away to another provider. Those are the sort of criteria. So you now have a top and a bottom. It's a sort of, you're like a box. And the top of the box is the ideal, and the bottom of the box is the minimum acceptable. That box is called the zone of tolerance. And that zone of tolerance is, yes,
we could do with some of that now.
A lot of people really do like it, and it really is captivating to them. They get really quite excited about it. As soon as you know what the zone of tolerance is, you've got context.
Yeah.
And that context now says, well, I am so many measurement points away from the ideal or above the minimum acceptable, whichever one you want to look at. Then I can actually understand, instead of looking at my performance as an organization, I look at the gap score, the gap between the ideal and the actual. And that, of course, when you get a gap, you can rank a series of gaps from the worst to the best. And the worst top 3 gaps are the ones you need to focus on. And that's the principle of all the things we do.
Yeah. And those become your challenges, which you can tactically overcome over time with the right strategy.
So we have 2 gaps that we provide to our clients. The first one is this performance gap, and the second one is the competitor gap. And the reason why we can do competitor gaps, because we, at the same time as asking their customers how well they're performing, we also ask their customers to score their competitors. And that's relatively straightforward as well. So you get these 2 gaps. Now, what happens in reality is that very often the ones where they need to close the gaps in performance are similar or close to or almost exactly the same as the ones needs they close against their competitors.
There's not a lot of difference in business, and I think that you're probably quite right when if you've got a better performing team and a better performing business, then you are selling the same thing as someone else. You're just doing it in a better way and making people happier, and then you reap the rewards of that.
Absolutely. And you know, if you take an organization, whether it's B2C or B2B, it doesn't really matter. You know, there are 2 things that they want to focus on. One is reducing customer churn. They want to keep their customers because that loyalty of those customers we know is a direct driver of profitability. And of course, profitability is what most chief executives are bonused on.
Yes.
And they want to keep their employees. The company is known by the people it keeps. And it is important that staff turnover is also reduced.
Absolutely.
One of the characteristics of staff turnover in organizations, and I had this recently, is that most leadership teams don't know the cost of staff turnover. And until you know that cost, you can't actually focus on it.
Yeah, and there's lots of, again, a bit like having too much information. That cost of having staff turnover very rarely covers or prescribes a number to the brain drain or unknown knowledge that disappears. Oh, Bob used to fill in that form every week. He hasn't done it for 6 months because he hasn't been here, but we forgot to do it. Compliance thing happens. The recruitment fees, the training fees, the energy, the time and the money that goes into those people all that then leave. And quite a lot of the time, clients leaving precedes staff leaving. Staff leaving increases the rate at which clients leave because you're then under servicing or you're under delivering on whatever it is that you're supposed to do. And then it becomes a mini snowball effect, which ultimately kills cash flow. And that cash flow killer is the silent, slow burn killer that most businesses don't look at well enough.
They don't.
So and the vast majority of the time it's, you know, top line numbers reported to a board and things like that, and, you know, high fives every couple of months. But the leading indicator of your future success or failure really ought to be looked at right now, because you've lost 3 key clients, and that's going to have an impact on staff and so on.
Absolutely. And, we've got a client at the moment where the CEO has as his personal KPI the experience gap with his customers. Now,
Yeah.
that's a brave thing to do. Most CEOs like to be focused on bonus. When Bernard Fournier was the chief executive of Rank Xerox, his key KPI was customer retention. And that's very unusual. But if you understand the cost of losing customers, the cost of keeping them, and the cost of acquiring new ones, when you start looking in those areas, customer acquisition costs and things like that, then you're actually onto the right track. Similarly, employee staff turnover. I've worked recently with organizations where the cost of employee staff turnover was over 10 million a year. Now, that doesn't appear on the profit and loss. It doesn't appear on the balance sheet, and yet it's a real cost.
Yes, yeah.
And importantly, the ones who do know about it will probably do something about it. But if they're not calculating it, how on earth are they going to do something about it?
It's crazy, isn't it? And one of the recent podcasts that I've recorded was with Amy Hopper. That was actually the first recording that we'd done. And she touched on the fact that sometimes the well-being of a team impacts the turnover almost as much as a client leaving and things like that. Do you guys touch on that sort of side of stuff as well, or
absolutely.
is that something where
Yeah, absolutely. And in one case, obviously not naming any clients, but we identified the chief reason for staff turnover was leadership, or rather lack of it.
I mean,
this is not unusual.
Harking back to your military days, it's very hard to build a leader. There's something kind of inside that person that can be trained out of them. But quite a lot of the time, business leaders or leaders in a business are only there because of it's their business, or they rose to seniority via time served. And sometimes that can have a negative impact in the long run. I remember, every win felt emotionally good. Every loss felt emotionally hard. And if you're the leader, then it's really, really hard not to have an impact on your team by expressing yourself. And sometimes
Absolutely. Actually, and over the decades in facilitating leadership teams, I've also facilitated them on leadership. And one of the characteristics of interesting, particularly entrepreneurs, is their strengths in excess become their liabilities. And those liabilities tend to emerge when the business is well established and it's going very, very well. What was good as a leader to starting it is not necessarily good for continuing it. Those characteristics that make them good for getting it going aren't always the right ones for the longer term.
Absolutely. So talk to me a little bit about this in your past life, just going back a little way before the boardrooms and things like that. I'm gonna plead ignorance and hopefully not be the only person that asks this question. And I definitely didn't look it up beforehand, so I want to make sure that I'm learning this for the first time. What is an equerry, and what did you do in that role?
Well, actually, I was serving still in the Royal Marines at that time. The equerry is pronounced equerry, and it varies according to the different households within the royal household. And the Queen had a household, Prince Philip had a household. I was running Prince Philip's daily program.
Okay.
So apologies from the clock in the background.
Oh well, the clock tells us that the clock tells us to keep time, but we're all right. Thanks very much.
So everything he did, every function that he went to, every event, I was the person who organized it from the household perspective. Of course, there's an organization who's also doing the organization. So my job was to be the interface between Prince Philip's household and the organization that he was going to. So let's say it was because he was a passionate, keen person on engineering, he would be going to one of the engineering organizations, the Royal Society of Engineering or one of the others. And I would liaise with the person who was the contact, usually the boss of that particular institution. And together we put together the program. I would then obviously write it all out, get it confirmed, do the logistics arrangements, and then brief His Royal Highness on what was going to happen.
Wow. I mean,
he then carried it out.
Not only a quite complex job, given the varying degrees of formalities and things like that are needed, but probably a bit of an interesting one, given how much of a character Prince Philip was. I've naturally heard stories of all those sorts of things. I've seen The Crown on on Netflix and things like that, and seemed like quite a
Much
sharp,
into that.
he seemed like quite a sharp, humorous character. So I'm guessing that not only did you have to organise a lot of things like that, but you probably saw an awful lot of funny things happen as well.
Prince Philip was a exceedingly intelligent, modernizing polymath. And one of the characters, I mean, if he had applied to it, I'm sure he would have been a member of Mensa. He was exceedingly intelligent and very, very capable. His pilot once said to me that flying with him was a complete joy because he was a better pilot than his pilot was.
So the pilot
and I
got
used to
some
sit in
time
the
off.
back.
Brilliant.
He loved flying, but he was a very, very competent and very inspirational person to work for. And I'd say also extremely demanding, as you would expect.
I was going to say, what was one of the things that you took away from that part of your career that you bring into your current?
High performance requires a focus on the key characteristics of the details that you need to have for each activity you're doing. So every event, the details are worked out in very great care. I think it's also worth saying that the Duke of Edinburgh was also somebody who, whilst the details were taken care of, he was not actually too concerned about them when he was dealing with the actual organization or when he was himself actually on the event or whatever it was. So once he'd read the background, and of course I provided him with a lot of that on the organization, of course in most of it he knew, then when he got the program, he understood the program, which he could frequently memorize. And then from then on, it was all about the bigger picture. There's a great Danish saying, "They who let the small things bind them leave the great undone behind him." And he was it's Pete Hein, Danish philosopher. And he was a terrific person for being able to manage both the high level and the details. And so there was for example, he wrote all his own speeches and typed them himself. And the skill set was just astonishing.
Yeah, I don't think that you can work in a role like that and not let it leave you with something that really does carry along with you, such as in Promising Outcomes, that attention to detail that's required with the amount of information that you need, but also understanding the underlying reasons a business grows and fails. It isn't just about the detail, but the detail is very bloody important. So
the detail gives you context. And of course, the third thing we do in the work with our clients is to facilitate them. We're all organizational development facilitators. We don't tell them stuff, we facilitate it with them. It's a very, very big difference.
Yeah.
And we help them to learn how to measure and how to improve. And one of the characteristics here is that we are, of course, the people who are taking insight, applying it to their business and giving them some sort of dialogue, a conversation about the characteristics that they should be focusing on. And of course, that's the facilitation. And sometimes the insight that we provide is quite threatening to individuals in the room. And so we have to be very deft and very careful about that. And one of the techniques that we use is the night before we might do a executive team workshop. We will usually myself or one of my team will be with the chief executive, briefing her or him on what's going to happen the next day, going through the insights with them and asking them questions like, who's in the meeting tomorrow going to feel most upset about this data? So we prepare to make sure that the people in the room are handled in a safe environment, and so that they get to that situation. So, and in one case, one particular executive of an organization did feel very concerned about it, and the CEO handled it brilliantly because he prepared it the night before.
Yeah, and the feeling of bruising and egos and things like that it can be quite horrible to hear something that is data which is provable and real insight,
particularly from customers.
Yeah, and as someone in a business that may well not, for any other reason than just needing to learn something, have to hear. And I think that sometimes you look at it and you might be trying your hardest and thinking you're doing your best, and there is no reason that there's no malice intended there. But you go into a meeting on a Monday morning, and the first thing you hear is, "Here are some performance things that you absolutely know are on you." it can be quite bruising. And I think, preparing for it in advance means that the language you choose,
Yes.
the body language that you display, the body language you look for, the listening that needs to be done as a direct result of that, not only means that the person who hears it buys into the outcome that is being planned for, or is able to understand their place in the changes that need to happen.
Absolutely. And when I'm facilitating, there's two little axioms I always use. One of which is I say to the group, how many of you today turn up to work with the intention of screwing up? And of course, nobody puts their hand up. And I say, well, nor do your people. And so unless you've got some genuine saboteurs, but I said, so we need to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
If there is a mess of some sort, then maybe it's not happening because it's somebody's intent. It's one of those characteristics of process and skills and activity. And interesting enough, one of the lessons I took from the last Queen Elizabeth, was to always have positive intent, understanding positive intent from other people, even if there was a problem or a mess. There was never this great hunt for the blame, to place blame on people.
Yeah.
The other axiom I use is one which is got from one of the clients years ago, which is you don't have to be ill to get better.
Okay, that's a thinking one.
And one of the great things about all of the work that we do with clients is, it isn't necessarily about saying, well, the past was bad. The past you can't undo, but you can do something about the future. And so thinking and helping them to think about how can we improve? What is our continuous improvement mechanism? What techniques are we using? How can we put in place those things which absolutely have been given to us by our customers, which have been given to us in an objective, independent, unbiased way? And so this is stuff that we need to pay attention to. And it is interesting. One of the characteristics of the organization we work with is that we find ourselves, and of course this is one of the pleasures of the job, is we find ourselves working with people who are genuinely interested in serving their customers, genuinely having a great team, and genuinely creating a great culture and a reputation in the marketplace for both their customers and their employees. If they're out just to make money, we're probably never going to work for them.
Yeah, they might not be a fit.
They're not likely to be a fit. But it is wonderful to see those leaders of businesses who are absolutely determined and have a very clear picture of what they're trying to achieve with their organization, where it should be placed in the marketplace and why, what's their reason for existing, and then turning that into either a great customer experience or a great employee experience. And those two drivers are, the heart of everything that we do, but they're also the heart of business success.
Yeah. Absolutely spot on. I'm gonna try and remember that second axiom. You don't have to be sick to get better.
Ill to get better.
Wow, ill, sick, ill. I'll go for ill. Talk to me a little bit, if I can, sort of go back in time a little bit further to your Royal Marines days. When you started in the Royal Marines, did you have any idea where you were heading with that, or what was the driver in there? Because my brother-in-law used to be a Royal Marine, and he signed up just because he wanted to go somewhere new. He wanted to do something different. Other people sign up for other reasons. And what was the real motivator, and where did you end up wanting to go with it?
I think it's probably summed up in a couple of words, one of which is working with very, very interesting people. And the second one is variety. I think that probably the third one is that because I used to play a lot of sport and games in my younger days, not very well, I might add, but I like physical exercise, and I still do. I think that the physical side of it was something that did come into play quite a lot. The other thing which I think is appeal, it's a bit more subconscious, is that you're joining an organization where one of the characteristics of it is very much based on a simple word. It's called selection. People don't get into certain parts of the armed forces without passing through what is known as selection. And selection in the Royal Marines starts with, even before you join, you're put through a selection process, and only a certain number of people make it. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that when you actually start as a completely green, novice into this, you are introduced into a learning and development environment, a training environment, whereby every single activity is, firstly, it's mandatory. There's no escaping this.
Yeah.
And
Really?
you have,
Yeah.
and actually, I think most people in the world were knowing that people in the armed forces are mandatorily trained on how to use weapons is probably a rather good thing.
Yes.
Uh,
I mean,
you know, the second characteristic is that the training is assessed, and every single week you are informed on how well you're progressing. And I don't see that in the civilian world. And so your training is assessed, you're told where you are ranked in accordance with the others on your training program. It's completely open, it's transparent. And interesting enough, it doesn't produce, as some people say, oh, this sort of competitive insight. Actually, you're all in the same boat and you're trying to get to the end of the journey.
yeah.
And the third characteristic is that the training in most cases is you have to have a pass in the training because it's assessed in order
Mhm.
to get promoted. And again, that doesn't happen in a lot of organizations. And I think this mandatory, assessed, and promoted, I call them the MAP characteristics, are one of the things that sets the armed forces apart from the rest. The Commando Training Center at Lympstone is the heart of the Royal Marines, and everyone knows that. It's where the doctrine of what we have been doing since the Second World War exists and is maintained. And it, of course, is a center of excellence. And there is a standard, a minimum acceptable standard, which you have to pass. And on the Commando course, you don't get your green beret until you've passed. And when you pass, then you know you've just joined one of the most exclusive clubs in the world. And the values and beliefs and mindset that
Yeah.
are come with wearing that green beret are absolutely essential to the culture of the organization.
Yeah, there must be a sense of fraternity in a way as well, where
Yep.
you've all been through the same thing that you couldn't get out of, but it was mandatory. So we've all been in this same thing, and you might not have been in my cohort that went through it, but you've been the cohort
Yes.
behind it or the cohort ahead. So I know that I can kind of trust you when you're saying this, that, or the other in regards to something which we all know that we learned and we passed and we got through.
Absolutely. And I'll take that further for you, because there's examples. You can meet somebody you never knew when you were serving, but you can meet them years and years later. And they just say, I was in the Royal Marines, and I say, fine, I'm just going straight to conversation 3. I can forget conversations 1 and 2 because I know exactly what it is you've been through and you know exactly what I've done. So we can start to talk to each other.
Yeah.
There's another characteristic, which I think is peculiar to the Royal Marines, which is interesting. I was talking to a person who worked for a charity and organization which placed veterans in jobs after they leave the armed forces. And he said Royal Marines are by far the best at creating entrepreneurs. And last week I was with about 7 or 8 Royal Marines who all started their own business. And it's interesting how the characteristics which made them suitable inside the Royal Marines, the selection process that got them there, are now being applied in a different format, in a different field. And those characteristics are still with them today. Indeed, the mindset, the commando mindset, which is all written down, is one of those characteristics.
Yeah, it's quite funny. There was a conversation I had, spoke to students at the University of Syracuse with the Company of Entrepreneurs relatively recently, and one of the questions was, "Do you believe entrepreneurs are made or born?" And I wrestled with it a little bit, and I personally have come to the conclusion that they're born, but opportunity allows them to exist. And
absolutely.
And literally, I may well have just given you my answer ahead of time, actually. But where do you sit on that? Because you've seen an awful lot of people in both business and in the professional military career. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think you're onto something there. I think there is an element of learning, and of course, one of the characteristics of many entrepreneurs is the history of failure. James Dyson didn't get his first vacuum working until 5,000 attempts or something like that. Edison was the same. Henry Royce at Rolls-Royce was the same. They're all people who tried and failed. So I think that's the first thing. I think if I come back to the learning piece, there are certain characteristics of entrepreneurs which I absolutely would also connect to, for example, the Marines. So, commando spirit has 4 words. It's courage, determination, selfishness, and cheerfulness. You've got to be able to keep going in an environment which is probably quite demanding. The first 13 years of my business, we didn't pay ourselves a salary. Entrepreneurs live, as the great quote says, and I like this one, are living a few years of their life like most people won't, so that they can spend the rest of their life like most people can't.
Yes, I love that.
And so, you have to put up with some hardship, and that requires determination, perseverance, self-discipline, humility, and a focus on excellence, because, entrepreneurs do things which are different from everyone else. That's why they're entrepreneurs. And there will be times when there will be some very black times, as well as some wonderful times. And I think that's the characteristic of the perseverance, the determination that is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
My wife actually said to me when I first started my first company, how did you know that it wouldn't fail? I said, it never entered my mind.
Yeah. Well, you don't start something knowing it will fail. You start something being aware that it may fail, but doing everything that you can within the bounds of human ability to prevent it from doing so.
Yeah.
And that's like kind of key, isn't it, really, that if I go into anything thinking it's going to be hard, then it will be hard. If I go into something thinking that it's going to fail, it probably will fail. If you go into something ignorantly, this won't fail because it's my idea, it might still fail, but as long as you know that there's a chance that might happen, you work to the opposite end. You work towards the success. And I think if my wife were to be asked the same question of me, I'd have probably given a very similar answer. All of the companies that I've started, the ones that have done well, the ones that haven't done well, the answer would be I didn't start them with the notion of failure. I started them with the hope of success. So just to sort of wrap things up a little bit, after all the years in the Royal Marines, working on high attention to detail, relatively high stakes things in the royal household, and now a few businesses in but running promising outcomes. What do you think is the driving force in your day to day that, not to sound morbid, gets you out of bed in the morning, ready to go for another day of running a business?
I think it's passion. You've got to have a passion for what you do. And I think it's very sad that a lot of people are working in jobs where they have no passion. And, if you don't have that determination, that passion to do something, and also some really clear focus on where you're going, that direction comes with the passion. You know where you want to get this thing to, by when, and also you're going to use some tools and techniques and methods to enable it to be well controlled whilst you're doing it. I'll give you one example, and we invented this. I'd never heard of it before, but when we started the company, we didn't know where our clients were going to come from. We didn't know where the business was going to come from, but we knew sure as hell that if we didn't get business, we were going to run out of money.
Yes.
And so we invented something called the room date. Room stands for run out of money. And the room date is something we look at every week. When are we going to run out of money? And when I was talking to some accountants, they said they'd never heard of this before. And I said, well, it's pretty simple. We survive on cash. We're not interested in profit and loss and balance sheets and stuff like that, because they're incidental to surviving on cash. So the passion and the detail that you have in being able to put all of this together has to have some sort of controls, and the room date is our control.
Yeah, that's interesting. I used to have a lights out money, and it was that was my number, which was if all clients left tomorrow, all bills still needed paying, and all staff needed their redundancy pay, how many months of lights out money do we have?
Yes,
and that would be the last person on the way out would turn off the lights, and it's not too far away from your thing there, but we used to have that as every single month in our management reports. We would be able to see how, if it was any less than say 3, 4, 5, 6 months, then we'd start to make concerned choices. But having it is essential, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have one of those as well. So we have the room date and the lights out date. The lights out date obviously is earlier than the room date.
Yes. Let's hope so. Rowan, it's been lovely talking to you, and I know as a freeman in the company of entrepreneurs that you've worked hard in your passion of entrepreneurialism, but you've also done it on your own bootstraps, should we say?
Yes.
And that passion is what keeps us all going, I think, when you're an entrepreneur. So thank you very much for coming on. And I can't wait to see you again at another function that we all take part in.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.